Judge Bennett? He looked up to see a tired-looking surgeon standing before him. The doctor's scrub cap was pulled off, crumpled in his hands. Bennett tried to read the expression on the man's face, the way he'd read countless witnesses over the years. Zoe made it through surgery, the doctor said, and Bennett felt his knees go weak with relief. The bullet damaged her shoulder and caused significant blood loss but missed her vital organs. She's young and strong. That helped. When can I see her? Bennett asked, his voice hoarse. She's in recovery now. Once she's stabilized, we'll move her to intensive care. You can see her then, but she'll be heavily sedated. Bennett nodded, words failing him. The doctor hesitated, then added, Sir, there are police officers asking to post a guard outside her room. They're saying it's for her protection, but I wanted to check with you first. A cold feeling spread through Bennett's chest. Whose protection? My daughter's or theirs? Before the doctor could answer, Bennett's phone rang. The screen showed a number he recognized. Police Commissioner Diane Phillips, an old colleague from his days as a prosecutor. Tom, I just heard. I'm so sorry, Phillips said when he answered. How is she? She survived surgery. No thanks to your officer. A pause. I understand you're upset. Upset? Bennett's voice rose, drawing glances from others in the waiting area. Your officer shot my unarmed daughter during a traffic stop. Upset doesn't begin to cover it, Diane. We're investigating what happened. Officer Reed has been placed on administrative leave pending. Administrative leave? He should be in a cell. There were witnesses, Diane. They saw everything. We're gathering all the evidence, including body camera footage and witness statements. I promise you, we'll get to the truth. Bennett closed his eyes, remembering how many times he'd heard similar promises in his courtroom. How many times he'd watched the system protect its own. I want that footage, Diane, all of it, unedited. Tom, you know I can't. My daughter is fighting for her life because one of your officers saw her reach for a phone and decided to shoot first and ask questions later. Don't tell me what you can't do. After he hung up, Bennett noticed several messages on his phone. News of the shooting had spread. Civil rights attorneys were offering their services. Reporters were requesting statements. His colleagues on the bench were expressing shock and support. And outside the hospital, the crowd had grown. Bennett could hear them through the windows, voices raised in anger and solidarity. Signs with Zoe's name alongside others who had faced similar violence. Chants demanding justice and accountability. A text message came through from his judicial assistant. CNN is covering the story. They're calling it Judge's Daughter Shot by Cop. Bennett put the phone away. Titles and headlines didn't matter now. Judge, daughter, cop. Those words were just labels that simplified a complex reality. Right now he was simply a father waiting to see if his child would open her eyes again. Across town at the police station, Officer Alan Reed sat alone in a small room. His service weapon had been taken for ballistics. His uniform replaced with civilian clothes. His body camera footage was being reviewed by internal affairs in the next room over. Reed's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd fired his weapon before in the line of duty, twice during his 8 years on the force. But never like this. Never in a situation that had escalated so quickly from routine to deadly. The door opened, and Sergeant Pat Wilson entered, face grim. How bad is it? Reed asked. Wilson sat down across from him. She's out of surgery. Critical, but stable. Reed let out a breath. Thank God. Don't thank him yet. This is a nightmare, Alan. The woman you shot is Federal Judge Bennett's daughter. She works for the Equal Justice Initiative. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. I didn't know who she was when I pulled her over, Reed said defensively. She was driving erratically. When I approached, she started arguing, then reached suddenly for something on the passenger seat. Wilson's expression didn't change. We've reviewed your body cam footage. Something in his tone made Reed look up sharply. And it doesn't show what you're describing. It shows a calm woman explaining her movements before she reaches for anything. It shows her telling you her father is a judge. And it shows her reaching for a ringing phone, not a weapon. Reed felt the room tilt slightly. She made a sudden movement. The footage doesn't show that, Alan. What it does show is you getting increasingly agitated. It shows you escalating the situation. And most damning of all, it shows you saying you people to her before the shooting. That's not what I meant. It doesn't matter what you meant. Wilson slammed his hand on the table. It matters what it looks like, and it looks bad. Really bad. Reed stared at his hands. What happens now? The union lawyer is on the way. Internal Affairs wants another interview. The DA's office will probably get involved given who the victim is. Wilson lowered his voice. And I've been ordered to collect your badge and gun. You're suspended pending investigation. As the sergeant left, Reed remained seated, trying to understand how a routine traffic stop had turned into this. In his mind, he'd acted on instinct, responding to a perceived threat. But the body camera had captured a different story, one that would be played on news channels across the country by morning. Dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital windows with pale light. In the ICU, machines beeped steadily, monitoring Zoe Bennett's vital signs. Her father sat beside her bed, looking older than he had just a day before. A gentle knock at the door drew his attention. A nurse entered, followed by a young doctor. "Judge Bennett, I'm Dr. Chen, the neurologist. We've been monitoring your daughter's brain activity. Will there be damage?" Bennett asked, the words sticking in his throat. "The good news is there's no indication of oxygen deprivation or traumatic brain injury. The bullet wound was confined to her shoulder and upper chest area. Neurologically, everything looks normal." Dr. Chen checked Zoe's chart. "We're reducing her sedation gradually. She should regain consciousness sometime today." Bennett nodded gratefully. As the medical team left, his phone buzzed with a message from an old law school friend who now worked at the Department of Justice. "Video leaked. It's bad. Call me." Within minutes, Bennett's phone was flooded with notifications. The body camera footage had somehow found its way to social media and news outlets. The nation was watching Officer Reed approach Zoe's car, hearing his aggressive tone, seeing the moment when Zoe reached for her ringing phone, and witnessing the split-second decision that sent her to the hospital. The footage contradicted the initial police statement, claiming Zoe had made threatening movements. It captured Reed's "you people" comment clearly. And most importantly, it showed Zoe doing exactly what she'd been taught to do, keeping her hands visible, narrating her movements, remaining calm even as the situation escalated. By mid-morning, the hospital hallway was filled with people wanting to see Bennett. The mayor, civil rights leaders, fellow judges. He refused them all, staying by Zoe's side, waiting for her to wake. When she finally did, it was with a small sound, not quite a word, more like a question. Her eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then focusing on her father's face. "Dad?" Her voice was barely audible. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines. "You're going to be okay." Her eyes moved around the room, taking in the hospital equipment, the flowers that had begun to arrive. "What happened?" Bennett hesitated. "How do you tell your child that the system you both believed in had nearly killed her?" "There was an incident during a traffic stop," he said carefully. "You were shot, but you're safe now." Understanding dawned slowly in Zoe's eyes, memories returning piece by piece. "The officer, he thought I was reaching for a weapon. I was just answering your call." Bennett nodded, his throat tight. "I know. Is he going to get away with it?" she asked, her voice stronger now, the lawyer in her emerging through the fog of medication. Before Bennett could answer, his phone rang again. It was Commissioner Phillips. "Tom, I've seen the footage. We're charging Reed. Aggravated assault with a firearm. Not attempted murder," Bennett asked, his free hand still holding his daughter's. "The DA feels assault charges are more likely to stick. They're also looking at civil rights violations." Bennett looked at Zoe, who was watching him intently. "It's not enough," he said into the phone. "But it's a start." As he ended the call, Zoe squeezed his hand weakly. "They're charging him?" "Yes, and the footage is public now. Everyone can see what really happened." Zoe closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Do you remember what you always told me about the law? That it's slow but eventually finds the truth?" Bennett nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Not after seeing his daughter's blood on her car seat. Not after watching that body camera footage. Outside the hospital, the crowd of protesters had grown even larger. Their voices rose in unison, demanding justice not just for Zoe Bennett, but for all those who hadn't had a federal judge for a father, whose stories hadn't made national news, whose shootings hadn't been captured on camera. The system was being forced to confront its failings in the harsh light of day. And in room 415 of Memorial Hospital, Judge Thomas Bennett began to understand that his greatest contribution to justice might not be from the bench, but from standing beside his daughter as she fought for change. 3 days after the shooting, Zoe Bennett was moved from intensive care to a private room. The hallway outside had two constants: a police officer posted at the door and a rotating group of protesters holding silent vigil. Hospital administration had tried to remove the protesters until Judge Bennett intervened, saying they had every right to be there. Inside the room, Zoe was propped up against pillows, her left arm immobilized, her face still pale but her eyes clear. The television was tuned to a news channel with the sound muted. Her own face kept appearing on screen, her law school graduation photo next to footage of the shooting scene. "You should turn that off," her father said, entering with a paper bag from her favorite deli. "I need to know what they're saying," Zoe replied, not looking away from the screen. "They're talking about Officer Reed's record now. 3 prior complaints of excessive force, all dismissed." Bennett set the food down and took the remote, not to turn off the TV but to raise the volume slightly. Sources within the department tell us Reed had been flagged for additional training after the second complaint but never completed the program. Due to staffing shortages, the reporter was saying, city officials have declined to comment on whether this represents a larger pattern of overlooked warning signs. Zoe's phone buzzed with a text message. She'd received hundreds since the shooting, from friends, colleagues, even strangers who'd found her number. This one was from her boss at the Legal Aid Center. "When you're ready, we need to talk about turning this into lasting change." "Everyone wants something from me," she said quietly. "They want me to be their symbol, their case study, their rallying cry." Bennett pulled a chair closer to her bed. "You don't owe anyone anything. Your only job right now is to heal." "That's not true, Dad, and you know it." Zoe gestured at the TV. "How many others has this happened to? How many didn't have a federal judge for a father? Didn't have body camera footage that got leaked? Didn't survive to tell their story?" A knock at the door interrupted them. A woman in a crisp pantsuit entered, her face familiar to both Bennetts from countless press conferences. "District Attorney Rivera," Bennett said, standing. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "We don't. I apologize for the surprise visit." Rivera glanced at Zoe. "How are you feeling, Ms. Bennett?" "Like I've been shot," Zoe replied dryly. "But I'm told I'm lucky." Rivera nodded, her expression softening briefly before turning professional again. "I wanted to update you both personally on where we stand with the case against Officer Reed." "You mean the case your office is building?" Bennett asked pointedly. "Or the case you're preparing to let fade away?" Rivera met his gaze directly. "I understand your skepticism, Judge Bennett. You've seen how these cases typically play out. But I want to assure you that my office is pursuing this vigorously." "What charges?" Zoe asked. "We're filing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and official misconduct. The grand jury hearing is scheduled for next week." Bennett frowned. "Not attempted murder?" "We've charged what we believe we can prove beyond reasonable doubt," Rivera said carefully. "Officer Reed's union has hired Gerald Thompson to represent him." Both Bennetts recognized the name. Thompson was notorious for defending police officers accused of misconduct, with a near-perfect record of acquittals or minimal sentences. "So you're already planning for failure," Zoe said. Rivera turned to her. "No, I'm being realistic about the challenges. But the video evidence is compelling and public sentiment is strongly in your favor." "Public sentiment," Zoe repeated. "That shouldn't matter in a courtroom. The evidence should be enough." "In an ideal world, yes." Rivera's voice had an edge of frustration. "But we don't live in that world. We live in one where juries are reluctant to convict police officers, where prosecutors have to work alongside the same departments they sometimes have to charge, and where politics influences every decision." The room fell silent except for the beeping of Zoe's heart monitor. Finally, Bennett spoke. "What do you need from us?" "Right now, nothing. Ms. Bennett's medical records have been subpoenaed. We have witness statements and the body camera footage. When you're well enough, we'll need a formal statement," Rivera said, addressing Zoe directly. As Rivera left, promising to keep them updated, Zoe turned to her father. "She's going to lose." Bennett couldn't argue. He'd presided over enough cases to know the odds. Instead, he asked, "What do you want to happen?" Zoe looked surprised by the question. "I want justice, and what does that look like to you? Reed in prison? Policy changes? Something else?" She thought for a moment. "All of it. I want him held accountable. I want the system that protected him, despite those previous complaints, to change. I want this to mean something. Bennett took her hand. Then we'll make it mean something. Across town, Officer Alan Reed sat in his kitchen staring at his laptop. The screen showed yet another news story about the shooting. This one featuring an interview with a police psychologist discussing the unconscious biases that might influence split-second decisions by officers. Reed closed the laptop harder than necessary. They didn't understand. None of them did. That moment when Zoe had reached toward the passenger seat, in his mind it hadn't been a calm, narrated movement like the video seemed to show. He'd perceived a threat, responded to a danger that in retrospect hadn't existed. His doorbell rang. Reed ignored it until his phone buzzed with a text from his union representative. "I'm at your door. Let me in." When Reed opened the door, Frank Hurley entered without waiting for an invitation, carrying a thick folder under his arm. "You look terrible," Hurley said bluntly. "Are you sleeping?" Reed shook his head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Save the guilt for your priest. Right now, we need to talk strategy." Hurley spread papers across Reed's kitchen table. "Gerald Thompson has agreed to represent you. He's the best there is for cases like this." "Cases like what?" Reed asked. "Where the cop messed up. Where an innocent person got hurt." Hurley looked up sharply. "Don't talk like that. Not to me, not to Thompson, and definitely not to anyone else. The department's official statement is that you responded to a perceived threat according to your training. But that's not. Listen to me carefully. Alan, the moment you start saying you messed up is the moment you lose everything. Your job, your pension, possibly your freedom. The DA is pushing for serious charges." Reed sank into a chair. "Maybe I deserve them." Hurley sat across from him. "Look, I've been where you are. Most officers have. That moment of doubt, wondering if you made the right call. But second-guessing yourself won't help anyone, especially not that woman." "Zoe," Reed said quietly. "Her name is Zoe Bennett." "Fine, Zoe Bennett. She's going to be okay physically. And you can bet she'll get a settlement that will set her up for life. The department will update some policies, run some new training programs, and everyone will move on. But only if you stick to the script." Reed looked at the papers spread before him. Incident reports, his service record, character statements from fellow officers. "What if I don't want to stick to the script?" he asked. "What if I want to tell the truth about what happened?" Hurley's expression hardened. "And what truth is that?" Reed hesitated. "That I saw a black woman reach for something, and I reacted differently than I would have if she'd been white. That all my training about staying calm and assessing actual threats went out the window in that moment." "Jesus Christ," Hurley muttered. "You say that in court, and you're not just sinking yourself, you're taking down every officer in the department. You'll be feeding right into the hands of those protesters." "Maybe they're right," Reed said. Hurley gathered his papers. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. Thompson will be in touch tomorrow to prep you for the grand jury. Get some sleep. And for God's sake, stay off social media and stop watching the news." After Hurley left, Reed sat alone in his kitchen for a long time. Then he did something he'd avoided since the shooting. He watched the full-body camera footage that had been leaked online. He saw himself approach Zoe's car, heard his own voice grow increasingly aggressive. He watched her remain calm, explaining her movements clearly. He heard himself say "you people" and flinched at the words. And he saw the moment when her phone rang, when she turned slightly toward it, and when he fired his weapon without proper cause. The person in that video wasn't the officer he thought he was. It was someone else, someone fearful, biased, dangerous. Reed closed the video and opened his email. He began typing a message to District Attorney Rivera. The next morning, Judge Bennett arrived at the hospital to find Zoe sitting up in a chair instead of her bed, dressed in loose clothing instead of a hospital gown. "The doctor hasn't approved your discharge," he said, concerned. "I'm not leaving," she assured him. "Just having a meeting." Before Bennett could ask what meeting, the door opened again. A group of people entered. 3 young lawyers from Zoe's Legal Aid Center, an older woman Bennett recognized as a prominent civil rights attorney, and 2 young men wearing T-shirts with Community Justice Initiative printed on them. "We're taking action," Zoe explained to her father. "Not just about my case, but about the whole system. These are the people who are going to help." One of the young lawyers, Tina Patel, spread documents on Zoe's hospital tray. "We've been researching Officer Reed's history and the department's handling of complaints. The pattern goes beyond Reed. There's a clear issue with how misconduct is reported, investigated, and addressed. We're preparing a class action, added civil rights attorney Vivian Grant, joining your case with others who've experienced similar incidents but didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. Bennett looked at his daughter. You sure you're up for this? It won't be easy, Zoe nodded. I've been thinking about what you asked, what justice looks like to me. It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about changing a system that treats some lives as more valuable than others. I have a platform now that others don't. I need to use it. As the group began discussing strategy, Bennett's phone rang. It was District Attorney Rivera. You need to come to my office, she said without preamble. Both of you, if Zoe is well enough. What's happened? Bennett asked. Officer Reed just walked into my office and offered to plead guilty. He wants to make a full statement acknowledging his actions were influenced by racial bias. Bennett looked at his daughter, surrounded by her coalition of justice seekers. We'll be there in an hour, he said. Something was shifting, not just in one case or one department, but in the foundations of a system that had resisted change for too long. And somehow Zoe Bennett, lying in a hospital bed with a bullet wound in her shoulder, had become the fulcrum on which that change was balanced. The news of Officer Alan Reed's decision to plead guilty spread through the city like wildfire. By the time Zoe and Judge Bennett arrived at the district attorney's office, reporters had already gathered outside. They shouted questions as the Bennetts entered, flanked by hospital security, who had volunteered to escort them. Inside, District Attorney Rivera led them to a conference room where Reed was waiting with his attorney, Gerald Thompson. The famous lawyer looked distinctly unhappy, his usual confident demeanor replaced with tight-lipped frustration. Reed stood when they entered. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, dark circles under his eyes. For a moment no one spoke. The air felt thick with all the things that couldn't be undone. Ms. Bennett, Reed finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Zoe studied the man who had shot her. In her dreams he'd been a monster, faceless, heartless. The reality was more complicated. He looked broken, human. Why? She asked. Not why are you sorry, but why did you shoot me? Reed seemed to understand the real question. I've been asking myself that since it happened. The body camera shows one thing, but in my mind, in that moment, he trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. But that's no excuse. I made assumptions about you based on your race. I escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. And when you reached for your phone, something in me reacted in a way that wasn't justified. Thompson placed a hand on Reed's arm, a clear signal to stop talking. But Reed shook it off. I've decided to plead guilty and to make a public statement about what happened, Reed continued. Not the department's version, but the truth. Officer Reed has made this decision against my strong recommendation, Thompson interjected. I want that on the record. De Rivera opened a folder. We're prepared to accept a guilty plea to the charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and official misconduct. The recommended sentence would be 5 to 7 years with possibility of parole after serving 3. Bennett frowned. That seems light for nearly killing someone. It's within sentencing guidelines, Rivera explained. And Officer Reed's cooperation and acknowledgement of racial bias as a factor will be invaluable for the broader conversation about police reform. This isn't about a conversation, Zoe said sharply. This is about justice. Reed looked directly at her. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't take away your pain or fear. But I want to be part of making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Thompson stood abruptly. I need a moment with my client, now. As Thompson led Reed from the room, Rivera turned to the Bennetts. This is unprecedented. We've never had an officer admit to racial bias in a shooting. His testimony could help change department policy, training protocols, everything. Zoe exchanged a glance with her father. If he goes through with it. Even if he does, Bennett added, one officer taking responsibility doesn't solve the systemic problems. Rivera nodded. True, but it's a crack in the wall. And sometimes that's how change begins. When Reed and Thompson returned, the attorney looked resigned. My client insists on proceeding with the guilty plea. However, we request that Ms. Bennett's civil suit be resolved as part of this agreement. That's not going to happen, Zoe said firmly. My case isn't just about what Officer Reed did to me. It's about the department that kept him on duty despite previous complaints. It's about the training that failed to address his biases. It's about the whole system. Reed nodded slowly. I understand. As they finalized the details of Reed's plea agreement, Zoe felt strangely hollow. She had expected to feel triumph or at least satisfaction in this moment. Instead, she felt the weight of how much work remained to be done. The courthouse steps were crowded the day of Reed's formal plea and sentencing. Protesters stood on one side with signs demanding justice and police accountability. On the other, a smaller group of police supporters argued that Reed was being sacrificed for political reasons. Inside, Judge Elaine Wong, specifically selected because she had no personal connections to Judge Bennett, presided over the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway. Reed stood before the bench, pale but composed. When asked how he pled to the charges, he responded clearly, "Guilty, Your Honor." Judge Wong reviewed the plea agreement carefully. "Before I accept this plea and impose the agreed-upon sentence, I want to be sure you understand the consequences, Officer Reed. You will likely never serve in law enforcement again. You will have a felony record. You will serve time in prison." "I understand, Your Honor," Reed replied. "Very well." Judge Wong looked out at the crowded courtroom. "I also want to address something unusual about this case. The defendant has prepared a statement acknowledging that racial bias played a role in his actions. I'm going to allow that statement as part of these proceedings because I believe it serves the public interest." Reed stepped forward and unfolded a paper, though he barely glanced at it as he spoke. "On the night I shot Zoe Bennett, I made a series of decisions that were influenced by racial bias. When I saw a black woman driving an expensive car, I made assumptions. When she told me her father was a judge, I became defensive. I didn't see her as someone deserving of respect and protection, the very things I swore to provide as an officer. I've spent weeks trying to justify my actions to myself, trying to blame my training or department culture or split-second decision-making, but the truth is simpler and harder to face. I saw Ms. Bennett differently because of her race, and that perception led me to pull the trigger when there was no actual threat. I can't undo what I did, but I can acknowledge it honestly, and I can accept the consequences, both legal and personal. To Ms. Bennett and her family, to my former colleagues who strive to serve with integrity, and to the community I failed to protect, I am deeply sorry." The courtroom remained silent as Reed returned to his seat. Judge Wong then invited Zoe to make a victim impact statement. With her arm still in a sling, she walked slowly to the podium. 6 weeks ago, I was driving home from work when Officer Reed pulled me over. Nothing in my life has been the same since. I still have nightmares. I still flinch at sudden movements. I'm still healing physically and emotionally. But this case isn't just about me. It's about a system that too often treats some lives as less valuable than others. Officer Reed has taken responsibility for his actions, and that matters. But one person's accountability doesn't fix a broken system. I don't take any pleasure in seeing Officer Reed go to prison. What I want is change. Real, lasting change in how police officers are trained, how misconduct is handled, and how communities are protected. I hope this case helps make that change possible. After both statements, Judge Wong officially accepted the plea agreement and sentenced Reed to 6 years in prison with possibility of parole after 3. As he was led away in handcuffs, Reed looked back once at Zoe and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of something that neither of them could fully put into words. Later that evening, Judge Bennett found Zoe sitting on the balcony of his apartment where she'd been staying since leaving the hospital. She was looking at her phone, scrolling through news coverage of the day's events. "You should rest," he said, joining her. "It's been a long day." "They're already spinning it," Zoe replied, showing him a headline. "One bad apple. Officer admits guilt in shooting of judge's daughter." "What did you expect?" Bennett asked. "I expected them to miss the point, which they have." She set the phone down. "They want to make this about one bad officer who's been punished, so everyone can move on and feel good about the system working." "Isn't that what happened?" "The system did work this time." Zoe looked at her father. "It worked because of who I am, because the shooting was caught on camera, because it became a national story. What about all the cases where those things aren't true?" Bennett had no answer for that. After a moment, Zoe continued. "I got a call from Vivian Grant today. The class action lawsuit is moving forward. 27 plaintiffs so far, all with stories similar to mine but without the media attention or the legal connections. That's going to be a tough fight, Bennett warned. Qualified immunity protects officers from most civil lawsuits. We're challenging that directly, arguing that it creates a system where there's no accountability. Zoe's expression was determined. The department has already announced reforms, implicit bias training, community oversight boards, the usual, but nothing that fundamentally changes the power dynamics. Bennett studied his daughter's face. In the week since the shooting, something in her had shifted. The trauma was still there, visible in the way she startled at loud noises and checked exits whenever she entered a room. But alongside it was a new resolve, a clarity of purpose. "They've offered me a position," she said suddenly. "The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. They want me to help develop new guidelines for police accountability." "Are you going to take it?" Zoe shook her head. "I can do more from the outside. Vivian has invited me to join her firm as a partner, focusing exclusively on police misconduct cases." "That's going to make you some powerful enemies," Bennett said carefully. "I already have those," Zoe replied with a hint of a smile. "Might as well earn them." As night fell over the city, they sat together in comfortable silence. The case that had begun with a traffic stop and a gunshot was officially closed in the court system. But the larger case, the one Zoe was now committed to fighting, was just beginning. In his decades on the bench, Judge Bennett had seen justice work in imperfect ways. Sometimes it moved forward in dramatic leaps, but more often in painful, incremental steps. Looking at his daughter now, he realized she might accomplish more change from her position than he ever had from his. "Whatever you decide to do next," he told her. "I'm proud of you." Zoe reached for his hand. "We're just getting started, Dad. We're just getting started." 1 year after the shooting, Zoe Bennett stood at a podium in front of City Hall. The spring sunshine warmed her face as she looked out at the crowd gathered before her. Community members, activists, reporters, and a row of city officials looking uncomfortable in their formal attire. "Today marks an important step forward," Zoe said into the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "The settlement we've reached in our class action lawsuit requires more than just financial compensation for victims of police misconduct. It mandates real structural changes in how our police department operates." She gestured to the document stacked beside her, the result of months of negotiation, legal battles, and public pressure. These reforms include independent oversight with actual authority to discipline officers, mandatory release of body camera footage within 48 hours of any use of force incident, and the end of qualified immunity for officers within our city limits. The crowd applauded. Behind Zoe sat her father, Judge Bennett, alongside Vivian Grant and the 27 other plaintiffs who had joined the lawsuit. Each had their own story of being wrongly targeted, harassed, or injured by police. Together, they had formed a powerful coalition that the city could no longer ignore. "This settlement is not perfect," Zoe continued honestly. "No single agreement can fix generations of systemic problems. But it's a beginning, a foundation we can build upon." As she finished her speech, Zoe caught sight of a familiar face at the edge of the crowd. Police Commissioner Diane Phillips stood with her arms crossed, expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly before Phillips turned and walked away. The old guard was still resistant, but they were running out of excuses and political cover. After the press conference, Zoe and her father walked through the park across from City Hall. The mayor looked like he was swallowing medicine up there, Bennett observed with a small smile. "He fought us every step of the way," Zoe agreed. "But when the Department of Justice announced their own investigation based on our evidence, he suddenly became very cooperative. They found a bench in a quiet corner of the park." Zoe's shoulder still ached sometimes when the weather changed. A physical reminder of how quickly life could pivot in unexpected directions. "I got a letter from Alan Reed yesterday," she said after a moment. Bennett raised his eyebrows. What did he want? "He's been working with a prison education program, talking to cadets at the police academy about his experience and the biases that led to his actions." Zoe looked down at her hands. "He asked if I would consider meeting with him. Are you going to?" Zoe had asked herself the same question all night. "I think so. Not for him, but for me, and maybe for others who might benefit from hearing our conversation." Bennett nodded, understanding. His daughter had changed over the past year. Stronger in some ways, more vulnerable in others. but always moving forward with clear purpose. I've been offered a teaching position, he said, changing the subject. Constitutional law at the university. I'm thinking of accepting and stepping down from the bench. Really? You love being a judge. I did, Bennett agreed. But lately I've been questioning how much change I can really affect from inside the system. Maybe it's time to help shape the next generation of legal minds instead. Zoe smiled. So we're both finding new paths. Inspired by you, her father said. Watching you turn trauma into purpose has been humbling. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching people pass by, a cross-section of the city they were working to transform. Across town, in a small office with Community Justice Alliance freshly painted on the door, Vivian Grant was meeting with the newest member of their legal team, a young lawyer named Carlos who had recently left the district attorney's office. The settlement is just the beginning, Vivian was saying as she arranged files on her desk. We need to ensure these reforms are actually implemented, not just written on paper. Carlos nodded. That's why I left the DA's office. I was tired of seeing promises made and then quietly abandoned when public attention moved on. The door opened and Zoe entered, still dressed in the formal suit she'd worn for the press conference. There she is, Vivian said warmly. The woman of the hour. Zoe shook her head. This victory belongs to everyone who shared their stories and stood their ground. She sat down at what had become her desk over the past year. What had started as volunteer work with Vivian's firm had evolved into a full-time commitment. Zoe had found that her experience, both as a victim of police violence and as someone with intimate knowledge of the legal system, gave her a unique perspective that proved valuable in their work. I've been thinking about next steps, Zoe said, pulling out her laptop. The settlement covers our city, but there are neighboring departments with equally troubling records. And the state legislature is considering a bill that would actually strengthen qualified immunity protections. Always looking ahead, Vivian noted with approval. But today maybe we celebrate a little? Zoe smiled. A little. Then back to work. Carlos's phone buzzed with a news alert. They're talking about the settlement on national news, he said, showing them the screen. They're calling it a potential model for other cities. That's the goal, Zoe replied. Not just change here, but everywhere. As they discussed strategy for the coming months, Zoe felt a familiar mix of determination and weariness. The work was never done, the fight never truly won. But each step forward mattered, each life impacted was worth the struggle. The prison visiting room was quieter than Zoe had expected. She sat at a small table, hands folded in front of her, waiting. When Alan Reed was brought in, he looked different from the man she remembered. Thinner, hair shorter, eyes more watchful. Thank you for coming, he said as he sat across from her. Zoe nodded but didn't immediately speak. This moment had played out in her mind dozens of times, but now that it was here she found herself carefully choosing her words. I got your letter, she finally said. You mentioned you're speaking to police cadets now. Reed nodded. Through a video program. I tell them about what happened, what I was thinking, the biases I didn't recognize in myself until it was too late. He paused. It's not enough. Nothing I do can ever be enough. But if it helps prevent another officer from making the same mistakes, is that how you see it? As a mistake? No, Reed said quickly. That's the wrong word. A mistake is forgetting your keys or taking a wrong turn. What I did was the result of deeply ingrained biases and a system that reinforced them rather than challenging them. Zoe studied his face, looking for signs of rehearsal or insincerity. She found none. The settlement we just reached with the city includes major reforms to police training, she told him, including education about implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. I heard, Reed said. It's a good start. But training alone won't fix everything. The culture needs to change too. The unwritten rules, the way officers talk when it's just them, the assumptions that become second nature. They talked for nearly an hour, not as victim and perpetrator, but as two people trying to understand how a moment of violence had altered both their lives and what could be learned from it. Before Zoe left, Reed asked, Do you think there's hope for real change? Honest answer. Zoe considered the question. I think change is happening, but it's slower and harder than it should be. And I think it requires constant pressure from both outside and inside the system. She met his eyes. Your voice from inside matters too, even from in here. Reed nodded. I'll keep talking then. Keep trying to make something good come from something terrible. As Zoe left the prison, she felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Not forgiveness exactly, that was too simple a word for the complex emotions involved. But perhaps a sense of purpose reaffirmed, of seeing the full circle of their shared story. 6 months later, Zoe stood in the back of a crowded auditorium at the state capitol. Lawmakers were voting on a police accountability bill that she and the Community Justice Alliance had helped draft. The bill would extend many of the reforms from their city settlement throughout the entire state. Her father stood beside her, now a full-time law professor and increasingly outspoken advocate for judicial reform. On her other side was Vivian Grant, watching the proceedings with the cautious optimism of someone who had seen too many promising efforts fail at the last minute. "The ayes have it," announced the legislative speaker. The bill passes. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Zoe felt her father's arm around her shoulders, a gentle squeeze of shared triumph. Later, as they walked down the steps of the Capitol building, reporters called out questions about what the new law would mean and what fights lay ahead. "Ms. Bennett, do you feel justice has finally been served?" Zoe paused, considering the question carefully. "Justice isn't an endpoint we reach," she replied. "It's a path we walk together, step by step, year after year. What happened to me was wrong, but it opened my eyes to wrongs that have been happening to others for generations. The work we're doing now isn't just about my case, it's about building a system that truly provides justice for everyone." As the reporters continued shouting questions, Zoe turned away. There would be time for more interviews, more advocacy, more battles in courtrooms and legislative halls. The work was ongoing, the journey far from complete. But on this day, walking between her father and her mentor, surrounded by allies who had become friends, Zoe felt something she hadn't experienced since the night of the shooting. A sense of peace, of purpose fulfilled, of momentum carrying them forward. The world was still deeply imperfect. The system still protected power more often than it delivered justice. Change still came too slowly at too high a cost, but change was coming. And Zoe Bennett, once defined by what had happened to her, was now defined by what she was making happen for others. The shooting had nearly taken her life, but it had also given her a voice and a mission that was larger than herself. As she walked into the evening sunlight, Zoe felt both the weight of that responsibility and the strength to carry it forward. One step at a time toward a justice no longer deferred.